Stay-at-home wives who refused intimacy. How did you react when he filed divorce? Story 1. I didn't refuse intimacy. I refused duty sex after a day of being a maid, nanny, cook, and therapist. When we had kids, he promised we were a team. Then his job got bigger and my world got smaller. By the time he came home, I'd already been touched 1,000 times. Sticky hands, crying faces, toddlers climbing me like furniture. He'd try to hug me and I'd flinch without meaning to. He'd sigh like I'd insulted him. "You don't even want me anymore," he'd say. "I'm exhausted," I'd whisper. Convenient. He started keeping score. If I didn't sleep with him, he'd go cold. No good morning, no how was your day. Just a man-shaped wall in our bed. I asked for help. I begged for a date night. I even scheduled a doctor visit because I thought something was wrong with me. The doctor asked, "Do you feel safe to rest?" And I laughed. Actually laughed. Because I hadn't rested in 5 years. One night he slapped divorce papers on the counter like a receipt. I'm not living like roommates. Something in me snapped. But not the way he expected. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just stared at the papers and realized he'd rather destroy our family than wash a dish or get up with the baby. "You'll regret this," he said. "No," I replied. "I'll finally sleep." The next day, I called his mom to pick up the kids for dinner and told her the truth. "Your son filed because I wouldn't perform on command." She went silent. Then she asked him, right in front of me, "Did you ever ask her if she was okay?" That was the first time he looked scared. Story 2. I used to initiate. Like, all the time. Then he started joking about my body after pregnancy. "Still cute, just softer," he'd say, grinning like I should thank him. If I got dressed up, he'd go, "Who are you trying to impress?" I stopped feeling like a wife and started feeling like an appliance with a face. He'd come home, toss his keys, glance at the clean house, and ask what's for dinner. If I was overwhelmed, he'd shrug. "You don't even have a real job." So yeah, my desire died, slowly, quietly, like a plant left in a dark room. He didn't notice until it affected him. Then suddenly it was an emergency. He tried to fix it with pressure. More sulking, more comments, more, "Are we doing it tonight?" Like he was ordering takeout. The night he filed for divorce, he expected me to break. He stood in the doorway like a judge. "I deserve affection," he said. "And I deserved respect," I shot back. He smirked. "Good luck out there." 2 weeks later, I got a part-time remote job through a friend. A month after that, he found out child support would be based on his income, and alimony was on the table because I'd sacrificed my career. His confidence melted. "Can we talk?" he asked, suddenly gentle. "Now you want to communicate?" I said. At mediation, he tried to paint me as frigid. The mediator, a woman with steel eyes, asked him, "How many nights did you handle bedtime? How many mornings did you do breakfast?" He blinked like the questions were in a foreign language. I watched him realize, live in real time, that he was about to pay for every moment he called my life easy. Story 3. My refusal wasn't about him. It was about what happened to me. After our second kid, intimacy started to hurt. Not a little uncomfortable. Hurt like my body was warning me. I told him. I showed him pamphlets. I asked him to come to the appointment with me. He rolled his eyes. "You're always tired. Always something." So I stopped trying. Every time he reached for me, my stomach tightened because I knew he'd get angry if I said no. And I'd feel gross if I said yes. Then he discovered a word, neglect. He started using it like a weapon. "You're neglecting me. I'm in pain," I'd say. "You're making excuses." When the divorce filing came, I actually felt relief first, then guilt for feeling relief. He paced the living room, acting wounded. "I'm not a monster for wanting my wife," he said. I looked at him and finally said the sentence I'd been swallowing for years. "You're not a monster for wanting intimacy. You're a monster for not caring if it hurts me." That hit him. Not because he cared, because it sounded bad out loud. He started telling people I withheld and used sex as control. I told the truth to exactly one person, my sister. She drove to my house, took one look at my face and said, "Pack a bag. You're done." In court, he tried to play victim. The judge asked about my medical records. My lawyer slid them across. Diagnosis. Treatment attempts. Notes about stress and lack of support. His lawyer stopped smiling. Afterward, in the hallway, my ex hissed, "You made me look like an abuser." I didn't raise my voice. "You did that all by yourself." Story 4. Our marriage turned into a shift schedule. He worked, I stayed home. That part was fine, until he started treating me like the home department and himself like the CEO. He'd critique everything. The laundry, the kids' snacks, the way the towels were folded. If I looked tired, he'd say, "Must be nice to sit at home all day." The bedroom became another place I was evaluated. If I wasn't enthusiastic, he'd complain that I was lazy. If I said no, He'd punish me with silence. If I tried to explain, he'd cut me off. You're always dramatic. So I shut down. I stopped offering pieces of myself to someone who only used them to measure my worth. When he filed for divorce, he expected panic. He expected me to beg to keep my easy life. Instead, I nodded like he'd finally said something honest. He froze. That's it? No tears? I already cried, I said. Just not in front of you. 2 days later, he realized he didn't know the kid's pediatrician's name. He didn't know their shoe sizes. He didn't know the teacher's email. He didn't know the bedtime routine. He called me during his first solo weekend like it was a crisis hotline. Which one likes the blue cup? The one you've lived with for 8 years, I replied. At the divorce hearing, he told the judge I was uncooperative and cold. The judge asked him a simple question. How many hours per week did you provide childcare? He hesitated. That hesitation was the loudest thing in the room. Story 5. Everyone thought we had the perfect setup. He worked. I stayed home. We had a nice house, cute kids, matching holiday photos. What they didn't see was how lonely it felt to be surrounded by noise all day and still have nobody actually see you. I tried to explain it to him once. I feel invisible. He laughed. You're literally home all day. What do you have to be stressed about? That's when I stopped trying. Our intimacy didn't disappear overnight. It starved. Every time he dismissed me, something in me closed. Every time he joked that I was lucky he didn't replace me, the lock turned tighter. He started watching those alpha podcasts. Suddenly, he was talking about wives respecting husbands and feminine duty. He'd quote strangers at dinner like it was scripture. Then he filed for divorce and acted like he was doing it for his mental health. I need a woman who actually wants her husband, he announced. I didn't argue. I pulled out a notebook. He frowned. What are you doing? Writing down everything I do, I said. For the next week, I tracked it all. School drop-offs, meals, laundry loads, appointments, cleaning hours, tantrums managed, nighttime wake-ups. At the end, I handed him the list. That's not a job, he scoffed. Then do it, I said, while I go get one. The first time he had to take the kids to the dentist alone, he came back looking haunted. They asked for forms. I didn't know. I know, I said softly. That's the problem. When the divorce papers were finalized, he tried one last time to twist the knife. You'll miss me when you're alone. I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it wasn't true. I've been alone, I told him. I was just married while it happened. Story 6. He told everyone I withheld like I was some villain with a plan. The truth? My body went into survival mode. I was home with a newborn, a toddler, and a husband who treated sleep like a personal weakness. At night, he'd slide into bed and whisper, "We finally have time." I'd stare at the ceiling, thinking about bottles, laundry, tomorrow's meltdown. If I said no, he'd roll away dramatically and scroll his phone like I'd cheated on him. One night, after I'd been up 3 times with the baby, he tried again. I flinched. He snapped. So that's it? I'm just a paycheck now? I said. I'm just empty. He filed for divorce the next week. He did it like a threat, expecting me to suddenly become the version of myself he missed. Instead, I asked, calm, when are you moving out? His face fell. You're not even going to fight? I fought, I said. Every day. Alone. He moved into his brother's place and instantly learned what it meant to do his own life. And the funny part? He kept texting me questions about the kids like he'd never bothered to learn their routines. When we met with lawyers, he tried to play the neglected husband. My attorney asked one question. How many nights did you handle the baby? He opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew the answer sounded like guilt. Story 7. I didn't refuse intimacy because I didn't love him. I refused because every touch came with a price tag. If I slept with him, he'd be nice for 2 days. If I didn't, he'd slam cabinets, sigh loudly, and talk to me like I was a roommate who owed rent. It got so predictable I could set a timer. Day 1. Cold shoulders. Day 2. Passive-aggressive jokes. Day 3. Guilt speech. Day 4. I'm done. Then he filed. Like a tantrum in legal form. He stood in the kitchen and said, maybe you'll understand when you're alone. I looked around at the mess, the toys, the unpaid emotional labor sitting in every corner, and I realized I already was. So I said, okay. That okay broke something in him. He started backpedaling immediately. Wait, you're really fine with this? I shrugged. I'm not fine. I'm free. At mediation, he tried to demand the house because he paid for it. The mediator asked, who maintained it? Who raised the children? Who gave up career growth? He stared like she'd insulted him by acknowledging my existence. That day, I walked out with temporary support, shared custody, and a strange new feeling, being believed. Story 8. After my 3rd miscarriage, intimacy felt like stepping back into a room full of ghosts. He didn't get that. He acted like grief had an expiration date, Can we just be normal again? He'd say, frustrated. I'd whisper, I'm trying. He'd answer, it's been months. So I stopped letting him touch me because it made me feel like a broken machine he kept trying to restart. He took it personally, of course. He started calling me cold and distant. Then he started testing me. Random hugs, sudden kisses, hands sliding under my shirt while I was loading the dishwasher. I'd pull away. He'd get offended. Wow, you really hate me. The day he filed for divorce, he acted like a hero escaping a cruel woman. I'm not living in a sexless marriage, he declared. I stared at the paperwork and said something that surprised even me. You're right. You shouldn't. He blinked. So, you agree? I agree, we're done, I said. You married my body, not my grief. Later, in court, he tried to use my refusal to paint me as unstable. My therapist's letter shut that down fast. The judge didn't look impressed by his performance. When he passed me in the hallway, he muttered, You made me look bad. I replied, No, you finally looked at yourself. Story 9. I stayed home because we agreed it made sense. But the moment I quit my job, his respect for me quietly died. He started referring to money as mine, my income, my savings, my house, like I was a guest who should be grateful for water and air. Intimacy became complicated because I couldn't unhear it. Being touched by someone who sees you as dependent feels less like love and more like ownership. He noticed the distance and decided the solution was pressure. You're a wife, he said one night, like that was a job title with duties. I replied, and you're a husband. Where's my partnership? He laughed, actually laughed. You don't get to negotiate. 2 weeks later, he filed for divorce and told me I'd be broke by winter. What he didn't know was I'd been quietly taking an online course at night. Not because I planned to leave, because I couldn't trust him anymore. When the legal paperwork started, his confidence turned to panic. He discovered that stay-at-home wife wasn't code for nothing. It was code for economic sacrifice, shared marital labor, and support calculations he hadn't bothered to understand. At the hearing, he whispered, This isn't fair, I whispered back. Neither was my life. Story 10. We didn't stop having sex because I stopped wanting him. We stopped because I stopped trusting him. He'd pick fights over nothing. Salt in dinner, a toy left out, then act like intimacy was a reset button. Let's not go to bed angry, he'd say, hand on my hip like he was being romantic. But it felt like manipulation. Hurt me. Then demand closeness so he could feel forgiven. I tried explaining it. I can't be intimate when you're mean to me, he scoffed. So I have to earn it? I said. You have to be kind. That's when he got furious. Like kindness was a humiliation. He filed for divorce after an argument where he called me useless because the kids were loud during his work call. That night he tried to kiss me anyway. I turned my face. The next morning, papers. He expected me to chase him. Instead, I took the kids to my sister's for the weekend and left him alone in the quiet house he claimed he wanted. He texted me 50 times. Come home, let's talk. You're really doing this? My favorite one was, I didn't mean it. At mediation, he kept saying he wanted to reconcile, while also insisting I admit I was at fault. The mediator finally said, Sir, you can't file for divorce and also demand she apologize for not stopping. I watched his face twist. Rage, shame, confusion, like he'd never heard consequences spoken out loud. Story 11. He swore he wasn't cheating. He just needed appreciation. That was his favorite word, like it covered everything he refused to do. When I stayed home with the kids, he stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a service. If dinner was late, he'd glare. If the house was messy, he'd point it out like a manager. Then at night, he'd reach for me like I was the one benefit he'd paid for. I tried to talk. I feel like you only touch me when you want something, he answered. I touch you because I'm your husband. That sentence made my stomach turn. Because it wasn't love, it was entitlement. So I started saying no, not cruelly, quietly, consistently, and he responded like I'd stolen his wallet. He filed for divorce after I refused on our anniversary. He did it with this smug calm, like he'd been waiting to punish me. You're going to learn, he said. I learned fast, yeah. I learned that the second I wasn't useful, he'd throw me away. And once I knew that, I stopped begging for scraps. At mediation, he tried to argue I should get less support because I chose not to be a wife. The mediator asked, did she choose to raise your children and maintain your household so you could advance your career? He started to answer, then remembered he'd told everyone my life was easy. He left that room pale. I left with a plan. Story 12. My doctor told me my hormones were off after childbirth and stress was making everything worse. I told my husband. I showed him the test results. He said, so basically you're saying I have to wait. I said, I'm saying I need help. I'm not okay. He nodded like he understood, then did nothing. No extra chores. No date nights. No watching the kids so I could nap. Just more pressure at night. Can we try? Not tonight? You always say that. He started turning down every request I made during the day. It was petty. If I asked him to pick up diapers, he'd say, "You can handle it." If I asked for a babysitter budget, he'd say, "We're saving." But somehow there was always money for his gym membership and work dinners. When he filed for divorce, he announced it like he'd won. I'm done being rejected, and I just laughed. Not happy laugh. More like disbelief. You're divorcing me because my body is struggling? I asked. I'm divorcing you because you don't care about me, he snapped. 2 months later, he learned what it cost to replace a full-time parent. Childcare quotes hit his inbox and his ego collapsed. He called me late one night. This is harder than I thought. I said, yeah, imagine living it. Story 13. He didn't want intimacy. He wanted control. It started small. He'd suggest what I should wear, then sulk if I didn't listen. He'd joke that I'd let myself go. He'd comment when I ate dessert. Then he'd try to initiate later like nothing happened. I stopped wanting him because I stopped feeling safe around him. Every compliment had a hook in it. You look good. For once, your body's still nice. Just don't gain more. So I refused. And when I refused, he got mean. He'd stomp around, slam doors, talk loudly on the phone about dead bedrooms like I wasn't in the room. He even started leaving his laptop open to forums about how to handle a withholding wife. I found it one day while cleaning. Withdrawal strategy, consequences. Lead with power. That's when I realized he wasn't my partner. He was my opponent. When he filed for divorce, he expected me to panic. Instead, I printed screenshots of everything I'd seen. In the lawyer's office, he tried to cry and say he felt unloved. My attorney slid the screenshots across the table. His face went gray. Explain this, my attorney said. And for the first time in our marriage, he didn't have a clever answer. He just stared at the floor like a kid caught stealing. Story 14. We went months without intimacy because I was taking care of his father. In our home, while raising our kids. While my husband worked late and pretended the situation didn't exist until it inconvenienced him. His dad had dementia and nights were brutal. I'd wake up to wandering, confusion, shouting. Some mornings I'd be so tired my hands shook pouring cereal. I told my husband, I can't do this alone. He said, you're home. You can manage. Then he had the nerve to complain I wasn't romantic anymore. The night he tried to initiate after his father screamed for an hour, I snapped. I'm not a switch. I'm a human. He got offended. So you're just going to reject me forever? 2 weeks later, divorce papers. His family called me crying. He's serious. What happened? I told them. Everything. The caregiving. The exhaustion. The way he treated me like a tool. His mother went silent and then said coldly, bring the kids to me. I'm going to talk to my son. When we met for custody arrangements, he looked different. Smaller. Like he'd realized his own mother didn't believe his neglected husband story. He tried one last time. If you'd just been a wife, I cut him off. I was being a nurse. For your family. And you repaid me with paperwork. The judge didn't care about his whining. The judge cared about facts. And the facts were ugly. Story 15. I didn't refuse intimacy. I refused being blamed for everything. If the kids were cranky, it was my fault. If he had a bad day at work, it was my fault for stressing him out. If he gained weight, it was my cooking. If he felt distant, it was because I wasn't affectionate enough. He'd criticize me all day, then expect me to melt at night. One evening he said, maybe if you actually tried, I wouldn't feel the need to file. I stared at him and said, file then. He looked shocked, like I'd broken the script. He filed the next week anyway, but suddenly he wasn't so confident. Because filing is easy. Living with your choices is harder. He moved out and discovered he had to do his own laundry, buy his own groceries, and manage his own children during his custody days. He kept texting me like I was still his assistant. What time is soccer? Where's his inhaler? What do they eat for breakfast? I answered once. You're their father. Figure it out. At the final hearing, he tried to act calm and mature. Then the judge asked him about his schedule and childcare plan. He stuttered. He hadn't planned. He'd assumed I'd still carry him, even divorced. When we walked out, he hissed, you're making this difficult. I smiled. No, I'm making it equal. Story 16. He loved telling people I was living the dream at home. Meanwhile, I was drowning in invisible work and a marriage that felt like a performance review. The worst part? He only wanted intimacy on nights I'd had the hardest days. After tantrums, after vomit, after no sleep, he'd slide behind me at the sink and say, we need to stay connected. I'd freeze. Because connected meant his needs. When I said no, he'd get theatrical. So I'm supposed to just accept being unwanted? I'd say, I'm not rejecting you. I'm exhausted. He'd reply, exhausted from what? That question killed whatever was left of my desire. The day he filed, he tried to make it look noble. I deserve affection. I nodded. And I deserve a husband who sees me. He didn't expect that. He expected begging. A month later, he called, voice shaky. The daycare waitlist is insane. I said, yeah. Parenting costs money when you don't outsource it to your wife. He hung up like I'd slapped him with reality. Story 17. I stopped being intimate because he made it impossible to feel feminine. Not with the way he'd come home and immediately criticize. The house, my hair, my mood, my tone. He'd point out dust like it was a moral failing. Then at night he'd act confused that I wasn't melting into his arms. Don't you miss me? He'd ask. I miss who you were, I said once, and it slipped out before I could stop it. That sentence haunted him. He started trying for about a week. Flowers, compliments, a fake softness, until I didn't immediately reward him with sex. Then the mask dropped. He filed for divorce in a rage, literally printing the papers at work and tossing them on the bed. I'm done being punished, he said. I stared at the papers and asked, do you think I enjoy this? Do you think I want to feel nothing? He scoffed. So now it's my fault? I didn't answer. I just started packing his suitcase. When he realized I wasn't chasing him, he panicked. You're really letting me go? I zipped the bag. You left a long time ago. Story 18. He told our friends I weaponized intimacy. He didn't mention the part where he weaponized money. Every time we argued, he'd remind me, I pay for everything. If I wanted new clothes, he'd say, do you really need that? If I wanted a cleaner once a month, he'd laugh, you're home. Then he'd come to bed and want me to be affectionate, warm, open, like my heart wasn't tightening around the word dependent. One night he said, you're lucky I'm patient. I replied, I'm not lucky. I'm trapped. He went silent. The next day, he filed for divorce like a revenge move. But in court, I pay for everything turned into, yes, she sacrificed income to support the family. His lawyer kept giving him that look. Stop talking. You're helping her. After a hearing, he cornered me in the hallway. You're trying to take my money, I said, calm. I'm trying to survive the life you demanded I live. He walked away like he'd never considered that survival was part of marriage. Story 19. I refused intimacy because it started feeling like a test I kept failing. He'd initiate, and if I wasn't instantly enthusiastic, he'd stop and say, wow, you're not even into it. If I tried to explain, he'd act wounded. I just want to feel wanted. So I'd force a smile sometimes, and afterward, I'd feel sick with myself, like I'd traded my comfort for peace. Eventually, I stopped. I told him, I need emotional safety. He answered, I need a wife. That's what he reduced me to, a job title. When he filed for divorce, he expected the world to side with him. And at first, people did. They heard dead bedroom and assumed I was cold. Then his sister visited one afternoon and saw me trying to calm a screaming toddler while cooking, cleaning, and holding a baby. She watched him stroll in, complain about dinner, and then slap my butt like I was his property. Her face changed. Later, she called me privately. I used to think you were the problem, she said. Now I think you're the only adult in that house. At the divorce meeting, she showed up as his support. She sat behind him, arms crossed, and every time he lied, she shook her head. He noticed. His voice started cracking. He realized even his own people were waking up. Story 20. We tried counseling. Twice. Both times he treated it like a courtroom where the therapist would declare me guilty and order me to fix myself. He'd say things like, she refuses intimacy, and I'm suffering. The therapist would ask, do you help with the home? He'd smile and say, I work. That's my part. When I spoke about burnout, he interrupted. See? Excuses. After the second session, the therapist took me aside and quietly said, you're carrying too much. And he doesn't seem interested in change. That night, my husband initiated like therapy was a coupon. Maybe we can reconnect, he said, hand already roaming. I stepped back. Not like this. He got angry. So counseling didn't work because you don't want it to, I said. Counseling didn't work because you went there to win, not to listen. He filed for divorce a week later, smug again. You'll regret throwing me away. But the regret didn't come to me. It came to him when he realized therapy notes, messages, and the pattern of control didn't make him look like a victim. At the final signing, he whispered, you could have just tried harder. I whispered back, I tried until I disappeared. Story 21. He acted like intimacy was a bill. Like if he paid the mortgage, I owed him my body. It started after I became a stay-at-home mom. He'd come home, glance at the kids, and head straight to the couch. If I asked for help, he'd say, I worked all day, as if I'd been on vacation. Then at night, he'd roll over and say, so, Are we going to be husband and wife? If I hesitated, he'd sigh like I'd ruined his evening. If I said no, he'd go full silent treatment. The next day, he'd barely speak to me, but he'd be loud on purpose, clanging dishes, slamming drawers, so I'd feel guilty. One evening, I finally said, "I can't want you when you punish me." He laughed. "Punish you? You're the one punishing me." 2 weeks later, divorce papers. He placed them on the table and said, "Smug, maybe you'll start appreciating what you had." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I looked at the papers and said, "Thank you." His face twitched. "For what?" "For making it official that I don't have to live like this anymore." When the custody schedule came up, he assumed I'd still do everything, just from a different address. The judge asked him about childcare on his days. He stared like he'd been asked to build a rocket. That's when he realized, divorce doesn't remove responsibility. It assigns it. Story 22. We had a rule in our marriage. No fighting in front of the kids. So he learned to fight quietly. He'd criticize me in whispers. He'd insult me with a smile. He'd poke at my insecurities like he was testing a bruise. Must be nice to stay home. Don't you ever miss being attractive? Maybe if you tried, I wouldn't feel so rejected. Then, at night, he'd expect intimacy like it would erase everything he'd said. I started refusing because I didn't want to reward cruelty. He accused me of withholding and started sleeping on the couch like a martyr. Then he filed for divorce and announced it like a victory. The funniest part? He told people I was lazy and unloving, while still calling me every day to ask where things were. What password do we use for the school portal? Where's the pediatrician number? Which kid hates ketchup again? One day I replied, "You really don't know them." It wasn't even mean. It was just true. He went quiet. Then, softer, "You're doing this to hurt me." I said, "No, I'm stopping you from using me." At the hearing, he tried to look like the reasonable one. But the judge asked about the kids, and he couldn't answer basic questions. Watching him stumble felt like watching a mask slide off in slow motion. Story 23. I stopped wanting intimacy after he turned my motherhood into a joke. If I was in sweatpants, he'd say, "Wow, fashion icon." If I asked for an hour alone, he'd say, "From what? Your busy day of Netflix?" If I cried, he'd say, "Here we go." So I learned to be numb. I learned to swallow everything. But numb doesn't lead to desire. Numb leads to distance. When he filed for divorce, he was weirdly excited, like he was finally getting revenge. He said, "You'll see how hard life is without me." Life was hard with him. Without him, at least there wasn't someone mocking me in my own home. A week after he moved out, the kids got sick at the same time. It was chaos. I texted him, "Can you take them tomorrow so I can sleep?" He replied, "I can't. I have plans." 2 days later, he called, "Can you take them an extra day?" "I can't handle it." I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was perfect. When we met with attorneys, he demanded 50-50 custody, until his lawyer explained what that actually meant. He immediately tried to negotiate down. He looked at me and hissed, "You're making me look bad." I said, "No, you're finally being seen." Story 24. My refusal wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A slow closing of a door I kept trying to reopen. I'd ask him to talk to me. He'd scroll his phone. I'd ask him to help with the kids. He'd say, "Later." I'd ask him to stop snapping at me. He'd say, "You're too sensitive." Then he'd want intimacy like emotional connection was optional. I remember the exact moment it died. I was crying in the bathroom because I felt like I was disappearing. And he knocked and said, annoyed, "Are you going to be done soon?" "I'm tired." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What's wrong?" Just, "Hurry up." After that, every time he touched me, it felt like being used. When he filed for divorce, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt clarity. He said, "I'm not living in a loveless marriage." I replied, "Neither am I." He tried to intimidate me by saying he'd tell everyone I withheld. I said, "Tell them, and I'll tell them why." At the first mediation, he started his speech about how neglected he felt. My lawyer asked, "What did you do to nurture the relationship?" He blinked. "I worked." My lawyer nodded slowly. So did she. That was the first time anyone said out loud what I'd been screaming silently for years. Story 25. He filed for divorce right after my birthday. Not because we fought. Not because something exploded. Because I didn't sleep with him that night. He'd planned it. I could tell. The cake, the fake smile, the way he kept touching my waist like a reminder of what he expected. When I said I was tired, his eyes went flat. He waited until the kids were asleep, then said, "Calm, I can't do this anymore." He slid the papers across the counter like he'd rehearsed it. "You're choosing this," he said. "You're choosing to reject me." I stared at him and realized he'd made my body the battlefield because It was the only place he could claim he was the victim, so I did something I'd never done. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I just said, okay, then we're done. He looked genuinely offended. That's all you have to say? Yes, I said, because I'm tired of proving I'm human. The next week, he started texting me photos of the kids during his time, like he wanted praise for basic parenting. Look, I made them dinner, he wrote. I didn't respond. At the final signing, he leaned close and whispered, "You'll regret not fighting for me." I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I'm finally fighting for myself." Story 26. He said he felt unwanted, but what he really felt was inconvenienced. Because the second I became a stay-at-home wife, he started treating me like I belonged to the house, like my brain shut off the moment I stopped earning a paycheck. He'd correct me in front of people. He'd laugh when I talked about being tired. He'd call my day cute. And then at night, he wanted intimacy like it was the one part of me he still respected. One evening he said, "You have energy to scroll your phone, but not for me?" I said, "My phone doesn't criticize me." He stared like I'd committed a crime. He filed the next week and told me, "Smug, maybe you'll remember what a husband is for." But the divorce process forced him to list everything. My years out of the workforce, the childcare, the household management. Suddenly, the cute little stay-at-home life had legal weight. At mediation, his lawyer asked if we could keep it civil. Then my husband opened his mouth and said, "She never contributed." The mediator raised an eyebrow. "She raised your children." My husband shrugged. "That's not money." The mediator didn't shrug back. "It's value." I watched him realize too late that devaluing me wasn't just cruel. It was expensive. Story 27. I refused intimacy because he turned every touch into a negotiation. If I said yes, he'd be pleasant the next day. If I said no, he'd punish me, ignoring me, refusing to help, acting offended over everything. I started feeling like I was training a dog, rewarding good behavior, preventing bad behavior, and that killed desire fast. I told him we needed counseling. He said, "So I'm the bad guy?" I said, "No, we're struggling." He said, "You're making it a big deal." Then he filed for divorce and suddenly wanted to talk, in the most insulting way possible. "You're going to throw away a whole marriage because you can't be affectionate?" he said. I answered, "We're throwing it away because you can't be kind without payment." He moved out and immediately started posting vague quotes online about loyal men being abandoned. People commented hearts. He soaked it up. 2 weeks later, he called, furious. "Why is the babysitter so expensive?" I said. "Because childcare is work." He went silent. Then, "So you're really not coming back?" I said. "You only miss me when you have to do my job." That's when he understood. I wasn't his wife in his mind. I was his unpaid staff. Story 28. I used to want him. Then he started using intimacy as proof that I was still his. He'd come up behind me, grab my hips and say, "Mine," like it was cute. If I pulled away, he'd frown. "Why are you being weird?" Because I didn't feel like a partner. I felt like a possession. After the kids, my body changed and my confidence was fragile. Instead of protecting that, he joked about it. "Your boobs used to sit higher," he said once, laughing. I stared at him. "Did you really just say that?" He waved it off. "Relax." I'm kidding. But my body didn't relax. It tightened, like it was bracing for impact. So I stopped being intimate. Not to punish him. To protect myself from feeling disgusting. He filed for divorce and told me, "You left me no choice." The crazy part? His mother called me crying, saying, "He says you stopped loving him." I told her the truth. I stopped feeling safe. Silence. Then she whispered, "Oh, at court, he tried to tell the judge I was emotionally withholding." The judge asked about communication, support, division of labor. He tried to dodge. And when he dodged, it was like watching a man sink in his own excuses. Story 29. He wanted intimacy after we fought. Every time. He'd say something cruel, I'd shut down, and then he'd try to make up in bed. Like sex would erase the words. I told him, "I need an apology, not a grab." He snapped, "So now I need permission to touch my wife?" That sentence made my skin crawl. I stopped being intimate because I started associating his touch with conflict, with control, with being cornered emotionally. When he filed for divorce, he tried to make it sound like I was the problem. "I'm lonely," he said dramatically. "She doesn't care." I looked him right in the eyes and said, "You don't get to wound me and then demand closeness as a bandage." He laughed, but it sounded nervous. Because suddenly it was clear enough that even he couldn't pretend. During the divorce, he tried to pressure me into giving up support by threatening to drag my name. I replied, "Go ahead. I've got years of messages." He didn't drag anything after that. He kept asking for reconciliation right up until the day the papers were final. Like he wanted the power of leaving without actually losing the benefits of me. And that, more than anything, proved I was doing the right thing. Story 30. I refused intimacy because I was depressed, and he treated my depression like an insult. He'd come home to a quiet house and say, "Why do you look like that?" I'd say, "I'm having a hard day." He'd roll his eyes. "You don't even work." I started hiding my emotions the way you hide bruises. At night, he'd initiate, and I'd feel panic. Not because he was violent, but because he acted like my sadness was a personal attack. If I said no, he'd say, "So I'm just supposed to accept this?" If I said yes, I'd stare at the wall afterward, feeling emptier than before. Eventually, I told him, "I need help. Therapy. Maybe medication." He said, "Or maybe you just need motivation." That's when I realized he didn't want a wife. He wanted a cheerful background character. He filed for divorce after I refused on a night I'd been crying silently in the bathroom. He didn't ask why I was crying. He just wanted what he wanted. When he moved out, the house felt lighter. Still hard, still lonely, but lighter. At the final hearing, he tried to say I was unstable. My therapist testified that I was stable, just unsupported for years. He stared at me afterward like he couldn't believe I'd found words for what he'd tried to dismiss. And I couldn't believe I'd waited so long to find my own voice. Story 31. He said the divorce was about intimacy, but the first time I realized it was really about power was when he tried to negotiate sex like a contract. "If we do it twice a week," he said, "I'll stop complaining." I blinked. "Stop complaining about what?" "About you," he answered, like it was normal. That night, I locked the bathroom door and cried quietly so the kids wouldn't hear. I felt like a vending machine that kept eating his coins and still not giving him what he wanted. So I stopped. Completely. Because every time I gave in, I hated myself more. When he filed for divorce, he left the papers on the counter next to the cereal, like he wanted me to see it with my morning coffee and collapse. I didn't. I read them. Then I cooked breakfast. He walked in, saw me normal, and got angry. "You're not even upset?" I said. "I'm not surprised." His face tightened. "So you admit you don't care?" I replied. "I care. I just don't accept being managed." Later, during custody discussions, he tried to demand I keep the kids most of the time because it fit his work schedule. So, he wanted divorce freedom with married-level parenting support. I told the mediator, he doesn't want a divorce. He wants a downgrade in responsibility. The mediator wrote that down. He went white. Story 32. After our second kid, I told him I felt touched out and overwhelmed. He nodded, kissed my forehead, and said, "Okay." Then he immediately added, "So, just quick, that was the moment my love turned into something brittle. I was up with babies, managing meals, appointments, tantrums, and a house that never stayed clean. He came home and acted like the kids were my hobby. 'You chose this,' he'd say. And at night, he'd act like intimacy was the only proof I wasn't failing as a wife. When I refused, he started helping in the worst way possible, doing one chore loudly and announcing it like a medal. 'I folded laundry,' he'd say, staring at me. I'd reply, 'Thanks, and what? And now you're in the mood, right?' It made me feel sick, like affection had become a trade. He filed for divorce after I laughed at him, because I honestly couldn't believe he'd reduced our marriage to a punch card. In mediation, he told everyone I was ungrateful. The mediator asked, 'What does gratitude look like to you?' He said, without thinking, 'Being available.' Silence. Heavy, embarrassed silence. I watched him realize he'd just told on himself. Story 33. He started sleeping in the guest room and blaming me for it, like he was a wounded hero. 'I can't share a bed with someone who doesn't want me,' he'd announce. But he never mentioned how he'd started picking fights right before bedtime. Over bills, over mess, over the way I talked back. Then he'd try to initiate like conflict was foreplay. I told him, 'Your anger doesn't turn off because you want sex.' He said, 'So now I'm not allowed to be frustrated?' I wasn't trying to control his feelings. I was trying to protect my body from being used as an apology he never spoke. He filed for divorce after a fight where he said, 'You're lucky anyone wants you.' That sentence burned the last bridge. When the papers came, I didn't beg. I said, 'Okay,' and I meant it. He panicked immediately. He started sending long texts about fixing things, about starting over, but he still didn't apologize. Not once. At the hearing, he tried to paint me as cold. Then the judge asked why he'd moved rooms months before filing. He stuttered, because the truth was, he'd been punishing me long before he left. Story 34. I refused intimacy because I didn't recognize myself anymore. I used to be confident, funny, flirty. Then years of being home, isolated, and criticized turned me into someone who whispered in her own house. He'd comment on my weight, my clothes, my energy. He'd joke about me being boring. He'd talk about his coworkers like they were exciting, alive, adult. Then he'd look at me and say, "Why can't you be like you used to be?" I wanted to scream, "Because you killed her." Instead, I just stopped letting him touch me. Because being touched by someone who made me feel small felt like humiliation. When he filed for divorce, he said, "Maybe this will wake you up." I replied, "It already did." That's when he got nasty. He threatened to tell everyone I was frigid. I told him, "Go ahead, and I'll tell them what you said to me." He stopped threatening after that. At mediation, he tried to act calm, but the mediator asked about emotional abuse and he started interrupting, correcting, arguing, like he couldn't help proving my point. I watched the mediator's eyes narrow, and I thought, finally, someone sees it. Story 35. He filed for divorce on a Tuesday like it was a business email. "We can't continue like this," he said. "I need intimacy." I almost laughed because the night before he'd yelled at me for buying the wrong brand of pasta. He wanted intimacy in a home where I walked on eggshells. When I refused, he told me I was breaking my vows. When I asked for kindness, he said, "You're trying to change me." So when he filed, I didn't act shocked. I acted organized. I made a folder. I printed messages. I wrote down dates, not because I was plotting revenge, because I was finally done being naive. He assumed I'd be helpless. He assumed I didn't know anything about finances because I stayed home. What he didn't know, I handled the bills, the insurance, the medical paperwork, the school forms. I wasn't ignorant, I was overworked. During the divorce process, he tried to hide money by forgetting accounts. My attorney found them anyway. When he got caught, he leaned toward me in the hallway and hissed, "You're making this ugly." I said, "You made it ugly when you lied." And for the first time, his confidence cracked like glass. Story 36. He used to kiss me in the kitchen. Then, slowly, the kisses turned into requests. And the requests turned into demands. If I wasn't in the mood, he'd say, "So what? I'm just supposed to live like a monk?" If I was tired, he'd say, "You're home all day." I stopped being intimate because every no became a punishment. He'd ignore me for days, refuse to help with the kids, then act shocked that I felt even less attracted to him. One night, I finally said, "Your reaction to rejection is why I reject you." He laughed. "That's backwards." "No," I said. "It's consequences." He filed for divorce like he was proud. He even told his friends, "I'm taking my life back." Then reality hit. He still had to parent. His first custody weekend, he called me 12 times. "What time do they sleep? Where are the pajamas? Why won't she stop crying?" I answered once, "Because she misses the parent who actually knows her." He stopped calling after that, not because he improved, because the truth embarrassed him. Story 37. I refused intimacy because I'd started to feel like I was sharing a house with a stranger. He'd come home, talk at me about work, then disappear into his phone. If I tried to share my day, he'd nod without listening. If I cried, he'd get annoyed. But at night, he suddenly remembered I existed. He'd roll over and say, "You're really going to do this again?" I'd whisper, "I miss you." He'd answer, "Then prove it." That "prove it" turned my stomach. So I stopped. I stopped proving. I stopped performing. I started protecting my heart from someone who only wanted it when it benefited him. When he filed for divorce, I asked him a question he didn't expect. "Name 3 things our kids are scared of." He stared. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It has everything to do with what you think love is," I said. At mediation, he tried to claim I was emotionally distant. The mediator asked how often he spent time with the kids after work. He said, "I'm tired." The mediator nodded. "So is she." He looked like he'd just been hit with his own words. Story 38. My refusal wasn't about sex. It was about fear. Not fear that he'd hit me, fear that he'd explode. If I said no, his mood would shift instantly. The air got sharp. He'd walk around the house like a storm, slamming doors, muttering insults just loud enough for me to hear. So intimacy felt like safety management, like I had to choose between my body and peace. Eventually, I told him, "I need you to stop scaring me." He scoffed. "Scaring you? You're so dramatic." That dismissal was worse than the anger. He filed for divorce after a night I refused and locked the bedroom door. He told people I was crazy. In court, he tried to act calm and reasonable. But under pressure, the real him leaked out. He interrupted. He raised his voice. He snapped at the mediator. The mediator literally said, "Sir, lower your tone." I watched his mask slip in front of strangers. And for the first time, I wasn't the only one who saw it. After the hearing, he whispered, "You made me look like a monster." I replied, "No, you just stopped hiding."